Okay, so hello everyone and welcome to this wonderful lecture session from the horror programme at the University of the Underground. I'm Aggie Haynes, I'm head of the horror programme, which is a critical exploration into illicit societal fears and human passion for horror. We're going to be investigating institutions and popular culture through the lens of the horror genre in dramaturgy, film, costume making and more. So the University of the Underground is a free, pluralistic and transnational university which was founded in 2017 and birthed in the basements of nightlife venues. So we're non-profit, we're a registered charity. If you'd like to donate, please visit the universityoftheunderground.org. And on this website, you can also find loads of other amazing and exciting programming, times and events, and amazing lectures like this one. And you can also watch them all on our Instagram. So today it's really exciting. We've got Dr. Kathryn Francis with us. So Katie joined Keele University as a lecturer in psychology in February 2001. Prior to this, she was a lecturer in the Division of Psychology at the University of Bradford. And before this, a postdoctoral research fellow across the Department of Philosophy and School of Psychology and Clinical Language Science at the University of Reading. So she has a particular interest in moral psychology and social cognition research, having published several papers looking at judgment behaviour discrepancy, which is saying one thing and doing something else in moral contexts. She is really interested to hear from a lot of students, so I'm sure is happy to be here, and particularly deals with things like moral psychology and cognition projects, as well as having amazing specialism in inter and transdisciplinary collaborations. So her research interests include things like moral inconsistency, morality and medicine, and morality and food choices. So Katie, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to you if you want to share your slides and get going. Thanks for joining.
Great, thanks Aggie, and thanks for such a warm, enthusiastic introduction. Let me share my slides and you can all tell me if you can see them. So bear with me a second. Is that working? Perfect, okay. So hi everyone, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today and to sort of contribute to this really exciting, really interesting program, and just looking at sort of previous speakers and what's sort of been lined up. It's really great to see such a sort of transdisciplinary program. So the main thing that I want to talk about today is obviously around moral psychology, which makes sense after Aggie's introduction, but also specifically around sort of physiological responses to horror. The first part of the talk title, I think, will make a lot more sense to you once I get going. So just to give you a feel for who I am and what I'm interested in before we dive into this today, I primarily describe myself as a moral psychologist, but an experimental psychologist. So one of the most interesting methods or approaches that I use to study human behavior is to kind of manipulate something and see how it affects what people do. And that's something that I find really cool and something that I'm really interested in. And as Aggie said, I've got quite an interdisciplinary background. So I've worked across sort of sciences and humanities as part of my postdoctoral work. And I'm really passionate about sci-art, hums in general, collaborations, as Aggie knows. So that's just gives you a feel for what I'm about. The way that I've structured the session today, which hopefully makes sense to everyone, is to really talk to you first about what moral psychology actually is. So you all might have some idea of what it is, but I'm going to give you a perspective from my field specifically. So we'll talk about, you know, what morality is, how we study it. I'd be interested in sort of seeing some of your reactions to how I describe those things. And then we'll talk about moral reactions. So how people actually respond to quite distressing situations, how we capture and measure those. So as a scientist, I'm really interested in measuring how people respond in those situations. And then we'll move on and we'll talk about what kinds of things affect our reactions to distressing and horrific situations. And that will kind of touch on trauma and resilience. And then finally, hopefully, I'll wrap it up bring it all together and talk about how I think moral psychology and perhaps psychology more generally can contribute to our understanding of reactions to horror. And I suppose in this sense, we're talking about natural horror, so horror that occurs sort of in the real world. If at any point something I say isn't clear, give me a confused look, wave at me. More than happy to take questions or explain something in a different way. So I want it to be as transparent and as open as possible. Right, so let's dive straight into moral psychology then. So what is morality? And if I were to have a quick chat with each of you, you'd probably have some sense of what morality is. And you'd probably use, feelings to describe that. The tricky thing with sort of experimental sciences is that we tend to have to define things in order to observe them and measure them. And that becomes really tricky with concepts like morality. So the way that I like to think about them is through using examples, using scenarios. And I'm going to do this throughout my talk today. So everyone be prepared to imagine lots of different situations. So in order to think about morality, I want you to imagine that you are walking through the street and you're on your way to get cash from sort of the hole in the wall from the bank. But when you get there, you notice that there's sort of this big wad of money on the floor. In that moment, when you spot that sort of bag of cash or wad of cash, you're going to be faced with a few decisions, and probably the first two that come to mind are, should I pick this up and pocket it for myself, or should I find the owner of this money? Those are probably the two most common responses. What determines what you do in that situation is what you believe to be right and what you believe to be wrong in that particular situation. So that's what I mean when I talk about morality. So what we think is right and wrong about our actions and our thoughts. So that in the field of moral psychology, that's what we mean when we talk about morality. And if we were going to formalize that perhaps even further, we'd maybe say it's certain codes of conduct that are put forward by society or a group. So there are some arguments that morality is, or aspects of morality at least, are universal. But there are lots of different moral rules and moral values that vary across cultures and are dictated by the group that you belong to. So that's morality in a nutshell. Now, the tricky thing is how on earth you study something like morality, because it's clearly complex, it's clearly multifaceted. And I just want to walk you through how we do this, or an approach that we take. Whether this is right or wrong is definitely a topic of debate, but this is typically what we do. So it's really difficult to study something that you can't observe, you can't measure easily. So the best thing to do is to break it up into sort of more manageable chunks. And I'd argue that in moral psychology, this has happened by sort of creating two streams of research. So the first is to look at how people make moral judgments. So how do we decide what's right and wrong? And as a moral psychologist, I might take lots of different approaches to trying to understand moral judgment. So I might use approaches from cognitive psychology. I might look at the neural basis of how people make moral judgments. Is there a moral seat in the human brain or in part of the human brain? But as a psychologist, I'm also interested in going beyond what people think or what people say they're going to do. I'm also interested in how they behave. And that's arguably the second stream of research that you typically find in moral psychology. So this is looking at how people actually act in light of their moral judgments. So how do people behave based on what they think is right and wrong? And I call that moral action. And as Aggie said right at the beginning, the relationship between these two things is something that I've been really interested in for quite some time now. So I look at both moral judgments and moral actions. So you can see this becomes sort of a more manageable way of studying morality if we break it into these two sort of component parts. Is that clear to everybody so far? Great. Okay, and the other thing that I want to do at this stage as well is really emphasize the role of emotion here, because I'm going to come back to this later on in the session. So when you think about kind of making a moral judgment or carrying out a moral behavior, you can think about sort of lots of different reasoning processes that would lead you to arrive at a particular moral judgment. But emotion also plays a role here. So emotion and reason both play a really important role in morality. And I'm really interested in emotion specifically for two reasons, because it plays a huge role in moral action and a huge role in moral judgment. And I just want to show you how. So when it comes to behavior, emotions motivate us. So they play a huge role in motivation. So, and this should feel intuitive to everyone. I'm sure we can think of plenty of examples. Certain emotions can motivate pro-social behaviors like cooperation, but you can think of other instances where emotions can motivate immoral behaviors as well. So emotion leads to motivation, leads to certain actions. So emotion plays a big role here. It's really important. And we can also go beyond this. And you can see emotions as serving almost as intuitions for a lot of the moral judgments that you make. So some moral judgments are driven by careful reasoning, but some are driven by emotions. And again, the best way to think about this is to use an example. So if you went outside right now and you saw somebody kick a cat, I'm sure most of us would have very strong emotional reactions to what we've seen. And subsequently, you'd make quite a quick moral judgment about the action that you've just seen. So they serve as these kind of intuitions that guide our moral judgments. Great. Okay, so we've talked about what morality is. Hopefully that's clear. You see it from this perspective. We've looked at kind of how we separate that. We study moral judgment, we can study moral actions, and emotion plays an important role in both of those things. And now that I've given you kind of that framework, that basis to work from, I want to talk about moral dilemmas. So once we've decided how we're going to measure morality, we've got to study it somehow. So in psychology, we typically have people either complete an online experiment or come into a lab, and we need them to do something. And if we want to study moral judgments or moral actions, we need to put them in a situation where they have to either make a moral judgment or undertake a moral action. So we have to put them in some kind of situation. And the way that we typically do this is by presenting them with a moral dilemma. And again, you probably all have a good feel for what a moral dilemma is. But again, just to walk you through some examples and what I mean by moral dilemma here. Again, let's take a couple of sort of example situations. So again, let's imagine that we're out and about shopping and we're running to catch a bus that we're late for. And as you're running, up ahead of you, there is a woman. She's with 3 young children and she's carrying loads of shopping bags. They're full to the brim. And just as you reach her, one of the bags breaks open and the shopping spills out all over the floor. In that moment, you might be faced with a moral dilemma because you have 2 choices. You could either stop and you could help this person who clearly requires help. But if you stop, you're going to miss your bus. The other alternative is you run to catch the bus and you don't help this person, so you fail to help them. And the reason why moral dilemmas are called dilemmas is because you have these 2 possible outcomes, and they usually involve some kind of benefit and some kind of drawback. And this is a really, simple everyday dilemma that I've presented you with now, but we can intensify this and we can change what's at stake. So really quickly, I can change how you might respond to this by including an extra variable. So I might say something like, the reason why you've got to run to catch the bus is because you have to pick your own children up from school. Or the reason why you have to run to catch the bus is because you need to give medication to somebody that you care for. And that immediately changes what's at stake in that situation. And it might prompt you to give a very different reaction or response. And we can go a step further. So let's take another situation instead. So here, imagine that you are witnessing a bank robbery, but it turns out you know who's robbing the bank, and there's somebody who desperately needs the money. And maybe let's say that's for a pro-social reason or an altruistic reason. Maybe they need the money to pay for really life-saving critical medication for their young child. Again, you're going to be faced with a moral dilemma in terms of how you respond. You could report this crime, but if you report the crime, the money's going to be returned to the bank, right? Or you could choose to ignore the crime because you think that it's being done for the right reasons, even if it goes against your moral values that, stealing is morally wrong. So all of these dilemmas are prompting that conflict. And so we use these moral dilemmas as a way of studying moral judgments and moral actions. Now, one of the areas that my research has really focused in is the domain of morality of harm. So I'm interested in life and death decision making, where the trade-off in these moral dilemmas is people's lives. So we kind of up the stakes even further in these kinds of cases. And typically, we've used trolley type problems to study this. So has anyone heard of the trolley problem? No, okay. So I'll introduce you to the trolley problem now and hopefully get some responses from you and see how you'd respond to these. So let me present the trolley problem to you. So the trolley problem has two different dilemmas as part of it. So I'm going to present one at a time. So you might be familiar with these once I present them to you. So let me present the switch dilemma first. So in the switch dilemma, there's a runaway train car or a runaway trolley heading down some train tracks towards 5 construction workers. They can't hear it approaching, and you have absolutely no way of warning them. If everything plays out as it is at the moment, that train car is going to hit and it's going to kill those 5 individuals. You are this person standing here, so you're standing next to a switch which operates some points in the track. If you flick that switch, the runaway train car will head down the neighboring track instead, which you can see over there, where there's only 1 construction worker. So you can choose to do nothing, and the runaway train car will hit and kill the 5 people, or you can flick the switch and it will be redirected down the neighboring track and it will kill only 1 person. So let me ask you all a question. Do you think it's morally acceptable in this situation to flick the switch? What does everyone think? Nodding, no's, thumbs up, unsure. Some nods. Okay.
No.
Let me present a slightly different version of this dilemma to you now. So the next side of this dilemma, or the other half of the trolley problem, is the footbridge dilemma. So this is similar, and similar events are playing out. Again, runaway train car heading down the track towards those 5 individuals. Again, it's going to hit and kill them if no action is taken. You're not in a position to warn them. This time, you're standing on a footbridge above the situation, and in front of you, there is this really large stranger. They don't look large in the diagram, but trust me, they're really large. And you have a slightly different decision that you could make. So in this case, you could push this person off the footbridge onto the track below. If the train car makes contact with their body, it will derail. So you'll kill this 1 person, but you'll save the 5 individuals. So let me ask you a similar question. Do you think this action is morally acceptable? So is it morally acceptable to push the person off the footbridge? Okay, much stronger responses. Some no's, some laughter.
Just don't think I could do it.
I'm so glad you said that, Aggie, because I'm going to come back to that point in a second, what you would actually do in that moment. So hopefully you can kind of get a sense for these trolley type problems. The trolley problem and the switch and the footbridge variant is probably the most famous, well-known case, but there are sets of these. And they're all similar in that they all involve this kind of trade-off of lives. So they all involve the same underlying premise. It's just the circumstances will change across them all. So these are the types of situations we use. But what's interesting is that for a long time, we presented these moral dilemmas as these text-based vignettes. So if you came to a moral psychology experiment, you'd have to read this, which is the text-based version of the footbridge dilemma. And then I'd ask you to respond to a couple of questions, just like I did now. So is it morally acceptable to do this thing, to push this person? Would you do it? And I'd record how you responded. So that's kind of the typical format, the typical way of capturing responses to this. But, and this is where Aggie's comment is really useful, you know, in these situations, you know, would you actually do this? You know, could this actually happen the way you say it would? And this is really where my research started in moral psychology. So I was really interested in the relationship between moral judgment and moral action or moral behavior, because we know from other areas of research and everyday life that what people say and do can be completely different. And I'm sure everyone here can think of examples of where people have been hypocritical. And that is also the case in moral contexts. We see it very, very often. But when it comes to studying moral behavior and moral actions in the domain of morality of harm, so when we're thinking about life and death decisions, we face huge ethical challenges. It would be completely inappropriate for us to expose participants to life and death situations or put them in those kind of situations to study the way they react and respond. And for those of you who aren't familiar with these early studies, this is original footage from some of the early Milgram experiments on obedience. So in these particular experiments, participants believed that they're administering fatal electric shocks to another participant. Unbeknownst to them, this is a stooge, but they don't know that. And these experiments really marked big changes in ethical protocols in psychology, because people became incredibly psychologically traumatized after taking part in these experiments. So we have to be really careful about what we present to participants and how we study some of these things. And this is where virtual reality technologies have slotted into the picture in this field. So using virtual reality, we can actually simulate very distressing moral dilemmas that can both look and feel real while also protecting the welfare of participants. So we take them sort of beyond the text-based vignettes that have been relied on for so long. And just to give you some images, I'll show you some sort of video footage in a minute as well. Here you can see some sort of screenshots of virtual reality moral dilemmas. In the top section of the screen, you can see one of the original footbridge dilemmas that we used. And it'll be interesting sort of comparing the differences to what we have now, actually. So this was some years ago. And along the bottom, you can see other types of sacrificial moral dilemmas that we've created in virtual reality. And what's really interesting about these is that they obviously have visual and auditory salience. They have a contextual richness that a text-based vignette just does not have. And for me, that makes them incredibly interesting in terms of studying people's reactions. And what's also valuable is that you can have events playing out in real time as if they were playing out in real life. So you can observe actions in the moment rather than, relying on somebody's reading speed and getting them to tell you what they would do in a particular situation. Okay, so that gives you a sense or some idea of how we capture, or at least how we look at morality in the field at the moment. Now, I want to talk about moral reactions. And I think hopefully this will start to be of interest in terms of sort of thinking about our physiological responses to particular situations as well. So how do we actually capture and measure how people respond to these situations? So obviously, first and foremost, we are looking at their decisions, so what they actually do in these situations. So if we go back to the footbridge dilemma, as I showed you before, you read a block of text describing this scenario. I ask you, is it morally acceptable to do this? Would you do it? You say yes or no, and I record that. And that really was the standard way of measuring this for some time. And I just want to show you some data, so what this typically looks like. So I'll walk you through this, but if anything's unclear, please let me know. So let me show you the data. So in this graph, along the y-axis, you've got the percentage of responses. And text at the bottom just means they're reading a text-based version of the footbridge dilemma. So in this particular study, they're just doing the footbridge dilemma. And you can see straight away that the majority of responses that people give are no, it's not morally acceptable to push this person off a footbridge. No, I would not do it. So the dark grey bars are people saying no. So that's clear straight away that the real dominant response here is a refusal to carry out that action, or a refusal to accept that that action is acceptable. And this is a really typical response when people respond to dilemmas like the footbridge. It's been found in many other studies, and it really does replicate many, many, many times. Okay, but we know now that we have this other way of studying moral decisions and simulated moral action specifically. So this is just a quick screenshot of a more recent version of the footbridge dilemma in virtual reality. This isn't actually the one we're using at the moment, but it's the previous version. And I just want you to get a sense of what it might be like if you were wearing a virtual reality headset, actually immersed in this situation. And what I find really interesting is that we no longer rely on any form of imagination. So when somebody's reading a text-based scenario or a story of any kind, they can use their imagination to interpret that in whatever way they want. Whereas now we have to construct everything that they see. So we can change the environment, we can change the weather, we can change the way the avatars look, we can change whether you have a body, what that body looks like, the way your hands look, the window of time you have to make a decision. And what you find is when you put people in these virtual reality versions of these moral dilemmas, they respond quite differently. So here we measure what they actually do. So in early experiments, they could either push, say, someone off a footbridge with a joystick, or carry out some kind of other action with a joystick. In the more recent moral dilemmas, they have hand controllers which map to virtual hands, so they can push someone, or they can just completely omit a response altogether. And what you get is a very different pattern of responses. So here you can see a completely flipped sort of response pattern. So when you present these moral dilemmas using VR, you get a much higher percentage of people actually saying yes. Well, they don't say yes, they actually push the virtual avatar or some other kind of sort of harmful action in virtual reality. And we found this flip pattern now across several different studies using different types of moral dilemmas. So this use of VR has really opened up other ways of capturing and measuring moral reactions and moral responses to these situations. And we're doing more work on this at the moment. And if anyone wants to find out more about that, please don't hesitate to get in touch with me about that. But the one thing that I really want to focus on is these moral reactions specifically, and whether we should be, or whether we're interested in looking beyond how people respond to a text-based vignette and beyond whether they push someone or they carry out some kind of harmful action in virtual reality using controllers or joysticks. So what other kind of reactions and responses would be meaningful and useful to us in order for us to understand how people react to distressing and horrific situations? And for me, what's been of real interest is these physiological responses that people have to distressing stimuli. So when I'm talking about physiological responses, I'm talking about the body's automatic reactions to a stimulus. And that could be, hugely varied. So just to give you a few examples, we've got sweating. So, if you're stressed out, if you're aroused in any way, you tend to become clammy or you tend to perspire. Different areas of your body will sweat. Heart rate changes. So if you become suddenly very afraid, your heart rate will increase rapidly. And that can be in a very short period of time. And even changes in your pupil size. So, research shows that if we're under huge amounts of pressure, if we experience high anxiety, intense fear, our pupils can contract or dilate depending on what neural mechanisms are responsible for that sort of emotional response. So I think physiological responses are here because they seem to capture a moral reaction that goes kind of beyond these initial decisions that people make. So I just want to show you what a typical physiological response might look like to the moral dilemmas I've shown you already. Again, if any of this is unclear, please let me know, because I'm happy to walk through it again for anyone who's interested. So here you've got heart rate changes in beats per minute on the y-axis. And when we study physiological responses, and here we're talking about heart rate change, what we tend to do is present a set of moral dilemmas, but we also present a set of stimuli, a set of scenarios, a set of dilemmas that aren't moral dilemmas. The reason why we do that is because it lets us see whether it's just the mode of presentation that affects heart rate. So, if we see big changes in heart rate just because someone's in virtual reality, that says to us immediately that actually it's virtual reality that triggers the change in heart rate rather than the moral content itself. So hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So we're kind of just controlling for that here. And the first thing to say really is that, so this is just from a study that we ran a few years ago, but the data typically looks like this in the general public, no matter how many times you run it. So you can see that when you give people vignettes to read that don't have moral content, so they're just kind of scenarios they have to respond to, you don't really see an increase in their heart rate, which is understandable. And the same goes for if you put someone in a virtual reality scenario where they have to do something, but it's not a moral decision they have to make. So there's no moral content. So you can see there's a slight dip in heart rate, but it's really insignificant. Now, what you tend to see is changes when it comes to moral content. So for a text-based moral dilemma, so if they read the footbridge dilemma, you'll see a slight increase in heart rate. It's not substantial, but you see a slight increase. And what's really important is that when you put them in virtual reality moral dilemmas, you see a much higher increase in heart rate. And perhaps that's not surprising, because in virtual reality, it's way more contextually salient. There's a lot more going on. There's sort of the added time pressure of things playing out in real time. I should say here as well that there are lots of different ways that you can measure someone's physiological response. So in some early studies, we did skin conductance response measures, but those are super hard to get accurate readings for if you also want people to be moving around in virtual reality. So a lot of physiological readings require people to be super still which isn't always that useful when you want them to be immersed in some kind of virtual world. So there are lots of practical decisions here as well. So what we've typically gone for is ear clip heart rate monitors, which are really neat. So they just clip on your earlobe and you can hook them to the back of somebody's top, and then you collect those readings. So they're quite practical, and they allow people to move quite freely. Okay, so that's moral reactions. Now let's move on, and hopefully we're sort of building a bigger picture now. So we've talked about what morality is, how we study it, and why physiological reactions or measuring physiological responses might be super useful to us. Now I want to talk about studying, or at least thinking about, what might affect our reactions to distressing and horrific events. So what might affect how we respond to these kind of morally relevant situations, these moral dilemmas. And there's loads of different individual differences, personal circumstances that affect how we respond to trauma and to tragic events and to distressing events. And one of the things that I've been researching that I'm really interested in is how occupation affects this, so how your profession affects this. And for some time, I've been really interested in what I call the helping professionals. So this encompasses lots of different professions, but the professionals that I've been particularly interested in are the fire service as emergency service professionals, and also out of hospital emergency service professionals, so paramedics in particular. And what's really important to think about when it comes to these professions is what they face on a day-to-day basis. So sometimes they might have relatively mundane shifts where, you know, substantial things don't happen, but on a regular basis they're going to be faced with quite distressing traumatic scenes. And sometimes these can be really horrific in terms of the injuries that they have to deal with. But also, if you think about the kinds of triage decisions they have to frequently make, you can see how these jobs would be really high stress, high pressure. So a lot of times, these individuals are deciding who requires attention first and who can wait until later, or, you know, more generally, whether action should happen or whether they should do nothing in a particular situation. So I was really interested early on looking at how occupying one of these professions would affect moral reactions, moral responses to these really difficult decisions. So I'm going to walk you through the results of a big project that I ran a few years ago now. And I'm doing some work at the moment, actually, some with doctors and also some with vets, which I'm happy to talk about afterwards as well. But I'll just walk you through what I have in terms of paramedics and the fire service today. Okay, so let me walk you through kind of the reasoning behind this, what we were interested in. So first and foremost, moral decisions, and this ties into what I've talked to you about before. So are these emergency service professionals going to be different in terms of their moral judgments? And we're measuring moral judgments using those text-based moral dilemmas. Are they going to be different in terms of how they respond in virtual reality? So are their moral actions going to be different? And then the thing that I was really interested in was their physiological reactions. So I was interested in looking at whether these professionals demonstrate emotional resilience in the face of really distressing traumatic events. And by emotional resilience here, I mean, do they self-regulate their physiological reactions to situations? And then finally, I was interested in moral emotions, and this is why I brought that up right at the beginning. So I was interested in looking at whether these professionals have lower empathy and less regret after they have to make a really difficult decision in a very distressing situation. And just to really emphasize what these two last questions really tell us. So if emergency service professionals can self-regulate things like their heart rate responses, And if they have diminished empathy and if they have less regret after they make a decision, then all of these are evidence that they develop some kind of resilience to traumatic situations, which we'd expect to see because these are people who have to make these decisions on a regular basis. So they're faced frequently with quite distressing and horrific situations. So if they want to sustain their well-being within those roles and not experience stress and burnout, we would probably expect to see these things. Okay, so let me walk you through the data and we'll do these one by one. So we'll do moral decisions first, then we'll look at their physiological responses, then we'll look at their moral emotions. If I'm going too fast or if anything isn't clear, wave at me frantically. We'll go back through it, no problem at all. So let's look at their moral decisions first. So this looks really similar to the data that I showed you before. So we'll look at how they respond to these text-based moral dilemmas first. So they're reading text-based moral dilemmas like the footbridge dilemma, and then they're responding by saying something's either morally acceptable or it's not, that they would do it or that they wouldn't do it. So let me show you that data first. Right, so dark bars are what we call the control group. That's just the general public. The pale grey bars, they're called paramedics here, but I think I should be more specific. So these are training paramedics. So they're students who are training to be paramedics. They have some practical experience, but it's really limited. So in most cases, these are first year training paramedic students. And then the stripy bars, those are incident commanders who work in the fire service in the UK. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the structure, an incident commander is a senior fire service officer. They are the person that gets called to the scene of an incident or an accident, and they're the one who has to manage what's going to happen. So do we act? Who's going to go where and do what? So they're really in charge of that decision making. Now, the first thing you might notice is that the paramedics or the training paramedics and the fire service commanders, they have slightly higher yes responses to these moral dilemmas. So they're more likely to say, yes, it's morally acceptable to do this particular thing, to push this person off a bridge. Yes, they would do it. But if you look at the numbers, it's not hugely different. So there's some variation here, but it's not substantial. What about how they respond to these virtual moral dilemmas? Again, what you see immediately is that there isn't huge variation between the general public and training professionals and experienced professionals. They're quite similar, right, in how they respond. What you do still see is that big difference in how people respond in virtual reality and how they respond to text-based dilemmas. So you're still seeing that big difference that I showed you before. So profession doesn't really seem to affect that difference. And that's something that I could talk about forever, but I'm not going to. But if you have questions about that, I'll happily answer them afterwards. What I want to show you is the physiological data, because I think that's more interesting. So remember I showed you, or I told you before, that when it comes to these kind of physiological responses, we give people these non-moral tasks as well. So they go in virtual reality and they do something, but it's not morally relevant at all. So they'll go and respond to something, but it won't have moral content, and they'll read a scenario and have to make a decision, but it won't be a moral decision. So we have those two tasks just so we can measure heart rate in those as well. And then they do the morally relevant tasks. So we put them in the virtual reality version of, say, the footbridge dilemma, and we measure their heart rate change. We get them to respond to the footbridge dilemma written as a text-based vignette, and we look at their heart rate change. So they're doing these 4 tasks. And every single person does all 4 of these. Now, this data is going to look messy to begin with, but do not worry, because I'm going to show you what's important here. So along the y-axis, you've got heart rate change again. And dark bars are the general public. Light grey bars are the paramedic students, and the stripy bars are the fire service again. So let me walk you through what's important here. So the first thing to say is that you see the exact pattern you'd expect to see when it comes to the general public, the one that I showed you before in terms of heart rate. So you don't see changes really in heart rate for non-moral text-based tasks, which you'd expect. You see a slight increase in the general public when they respond to a text-based moral vignette. So that's what I showed you before. It's not a huge change. It's really small. But you get that big change in virtual reality. So not much change when they just do any virtual reality task, but then this big increase in heart rate change when they have to respond to a virtual moral dilemma. So hopefully that's clear. That maps onto what we've seen before. Let's look at the other groups. So let's look at the paramedic students. So again, no change this time when it comes to the text. So they're not showing any heart rate changes when they respond to a text scenario, even if it's a moral dilemma. So you don't get any change there whatsoever. You do get an increase when they respond to the virtual moral dilemma, but you can see that the size of that effect is much lower than it is in the general public, right? It's about half the size. So their heart rate increases, but not as much as when a member of the public does the same task. Okay, hopefully that's clear from the graph. And then the most interesting finding is the data from the experienced incident commanders working in the fire service. So let me show you that. So for text-based scenarios, nothing at all. That's a flat line. So no change. Even if it's a text-based moral dilemma, no changes in heart rate. And then really, really importantly, no changes even when you present moral dilemmas in virtual reality. So you do not see that physiological arousal response happening. And if we map this change with years of experience working in the emergency services, you can see that heart rate change declines with years working in the emergency services. So with years of exposure to these kinds of situations, you're seeing a decrease in sort of heart rate responses. Let me walk you through the emotion data too, because this is really interesting. And this has prompted some more recent work. So I said before that I was really interested in empathy in these professionals. And I think empathy has a big role to play in terms of how we respond to horrific situations. And it's certainly worth thinking about. So when we talk about empathy, again, I'm sure we all have an idea of what we mean by empathy, but typically we can break it down into different types of empathy, and I'm going to show you what they are. So along the bottom, you can see 3 different types of empathy, and I'm just going to explain what they are. So perspective taking is kind of like a cognitive empathy. So that's, you know, the phrase stepping into someone else's shoes, that's perspective taking. So you can recognize and understand how somebody else feels. Now, what you can see is that in the general public, paramedic students in training and experienced incident commanders in the fire service, they do not have significant differences in their perspective taking. So all 3 of those groups are pretty good at understanding how somebody else feels, at stepping in the shoes of somebody else. So there aren't big differences there. Then we've got empathic concern. So empathy also has an affective and emotional dimension, right? So it goes beyond perspective taking. So I can also feel what you feel, right? That's empathic concern. And you'll see that in their affective empathy, in their ability to feel concerned because you are, they also don't show differences. Very similar. That they're capable of stepping into the shoes of somebody else, and they're capable of feeling what somebody else is feeling. So those seem to be consistent across all 3 groups. Now, the last dimension that I want to talk about is personal distress. And this is talked about less in terms of empathy. And it's quite a self-oriented emotion. So this is when you become really distressed at the thought of or at the sight of somebody else's discomfort. So it's really sort of self-oriented. So regardless of what someone else is feeling, you're becoming really uncomfortable and distressed by it. And you'll see that in trained professionals, this decreases. So in the general public, it's much higher than it is in both paramedics in training and in experienced incident commanders in the fire service. So there are differences in certain types of empathy, not all types of empathy. And again, if you map this to years of experience working in those professions, you see a decline. So personal distress, so becoming distressed and really uncomfortable when someone else is hurt or in distress, decreases with the amount of time you've been working in one of these professions and with your exposure to these kinds of horrific situations. And the last bit of data that I want to show you from this, because I think this is really interesting, is the data on regret. So whenever we run these studies, I'm always interested in asking people after they've done something, did you do the right thing? Because I think it's really interesting seeing what people say afterwards. So after somebody responds in virtual reality, so say we give them the footbridge dilemma and they either choose to push the person off the footbridge or they refuse to do anything and they don't do it, we say, did you take the right action? And what you typically get in the general public is more people saying, no, I didn't take the right action, and they express regret. Most of the time, regardless of what they do, they would say they would do something very different in the future. If you record these responses for emergency service professionals, you get something very different. So most of these professionals, whether they're in training or whether they're experienced, will say, yes, I took the right action, regardless of what they did. And this is really interesting and important because it means that these individuals don't ruminate after the fact. So once they've experienced something that's very distressing and they've taken a decision, they do not spend time ruminating on what could have been different and whether they should have done what they did. Most of them will assert that what they did was the right thing to do. And again, that really helps build resilience over time, because if you spend too long regretting what you've done, you can't really move forward and make decisions in future situations. So these are really interesting results, I think, in terms of emotions. Okay, so let's wrap up this section. So from the research that we're doing at the moment in sort of this area looking at occupation, we can say that if individuals are regularly exposed to really horrific or distressing situations, they do develop resilience. And we now show that they're developing that resilience in 3 different ways, right? Just by looking at their reactions. So they have reduced physiological arousal. So they seem to be engaging in this process of regulating their own emotion. They show reduced regret following a decision. So they're not ruminating on what could have been. They're sticking with what they did as being the right decision. And they show decreased levels of personal distress over time with exposure to these distressing events. So they're becoming less and less distressed in the face of someone else's trauma or someone else's unpleasant experience. So hopefully that kind of wraps that up together. So I'm going to just bring it all together now and leave time for questions and conversation. So after sort of presenting all of this, I really wanted to think about, how moral psychology and how psychology then can contribute to our understanding of reactions to horror. So how can we bring all of this together? And the first thing that I thought about was these emotions, these reactive responses. And I think when you think about any kind of distressing and morally relevant scenarios, they can evoke a huge range of different emotions. I've only touched on a few today, but I just wanted to present a few more that I think might be of interest to all of you. So we can group these emotions in a meaningful way. So if people experience these really distressing, horrific situations, it can actually evoke pro-social emotions. So things like concern, compassion, and empathy, but also self-blame emotions. So these are really self-oriented, things like guilt and shame. But at the same time, they can be other oriented emotions, other blame emotions like contempt, anger, and disgust. So you can see the sort of complexity or pool of different responses that people can have to these kinds of situations. And what's interesting, if you look at work on horror in moral psychology, is that horror is often elicited when something contradicts our underlying moral values. And that will subsequently provoke these kinds of moral emotions, so the ones listed above. And so I think if we can study these reactive responses, and if we can study these moral emotions, it really helps us to understand what horrifies us and the moral underpinnings of horror, which is clearly complicated and quite multifaceted. And if there's anything that I really want to emphasize from talking to you all today, it's really about individual differences. So just from these studies, we've shown that people's reactive responses to these situations vary hugely. And they vary as a result of a number of different things. So we've shown that, presenting moral dilemmas in virtual reality, for the general public at least, prompts these really strong physiological reactions that you do not see when you present materials sort of in a text-based format. We've shown that our own experiences really modify and mediate how we react to these distressing situations. So occupation, not just the type of occupation you have, but the length of time you've been working in that occupation affects your reactions to these situations. The type of training you're getting, exposure to distressing events and trauma. And I think that speaks to other areas of research as well. How much exposure have you had to horrific stimuli? And is that going to mediate how you react to it? And then perhaps most importantly, our own traits and the state that we're in right now will seriously affect how we react to these kinds of situations. So empathy levels, personal distress, which we talked about today, but also your present state of anxiety, your present levels of stress will really affect how strongly you respond to some of these situations. But I'll wrap it up there, because I want to give time to have a chat. Just to say thank you to everyone that I've worked with, because everyone's awesome. And this kind of work just doesn't come from one person working in a silo. So just to say thanks to all of my wonderful collaborators, and looking forward to having a chat with you all.
Katie, thank you so much. So amazing to hear as well, particularly because this group, we're looking at like how to create art horror as a means of dealing with natural horror, or to sort of like, particularly in institutional context. And I think it's really interesting you brought up two things, particularly that the medium is so important to the psychological response of the audience, which I think is really amazing, that like you have evidence of that. And at the moment, everyone, all the students here, like researchers, they're trying to work out what medium they might want to use to share their ideas. So it's really interesting to know that some work in different ways than others, but also that, obviously seeing how the paramedics and the firefighters responded, that like the type of audience you're talking to is so important, that they might have a really different response than someone else. Is so interesting. Yeah, so thank you so much.
No worries at all. That's fascinating. Really interesting.
So I know we're very near the end of time, but has anyone got any questions after Katie's talk?
Yeah, I just had a question. Thank you, Kathryn, for your talk. I was just wondering, like with the VR, how do you like evaluate something if it's not a true situation? Because like VR, we know that we are a character. So it's a kind of game. In a game, when you have the choice to kill or not kill, most of the time you kill, because there is this attraction for violent. So do you base the reactions we have in virtual reality as a real like behavior, or is it more part of a game behavior? Or like, I don't know if I formulated well, but
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. No, I totally agree with you. I think that there's so many nuances around this, and there's a million things that I could say, but I'll try and keep it short. So there's a few different things to consider, really. So there's the mode of virtual reality itself, which is tricky, right? But there's also the trolley problems themselves, which are also tricky because they're quite extreme. So, you're not going to come across a trolley problem really in the real world, especially one like the footbridge dilemma. So when it comes to sort of making inferences about real world behavior, I don't think we can do that if we're using virtual reality trolley problems. And the main reason why I don't think we can do that is because we can't match it to any instance like that that's happened in real life. So one of the things that we're doing at the moment is creating moral dilemmas that are based on tragedies that have happened in real life. So that's kind of one thing that we've been doing to tackle that. In terms of the VR format itself, I think those questions are absolutely fascinating. And we have some preliminary evidence that what people do in virtual reality is different to how they respond to a game. And one of the things that I think is, really fascinating about this is that in the UK, a lot of emergency service professionals use virtual reality for their training. So there are big virtual reality training centres, and they do a lot of their kind of formal examinations in VR simulations. And the argument from those professionals has always been, the context in which you run this training is really important. People don't think they're playing a game where they can just, have a go, try different things out for the fun of it. So it certainly seems to be about framing. And then the last thing that I want to say on that, because I think it's, you bring up such an important question, and I love this area of research, is more recently, I've started doing some work with a colleague at Keele University, Dr. Rowan Capitan, on this concept of cognitive quarantine. And it's this idea that, you might have an identity, and does it go with you into a gaming environment? Or do you become a different person in a certain world, in a certain environment? So for some people, when they play games, they very much carry their moral compass into it. For other people, they use it as an opportunity to really go to the other extreme, right? And that's something that's not really understood yet, let alone understood in terms of going into a virtual world. So the answer to your question is there really isn't a clear answer yet. But there's plenty of ongoing interesting research in that area. So I think you really identified and brought out an important point there. So thank you.
Cool. Anyone else?
If anyone has questions afterwards, don't hesitate to contact me. That's not a problem at all. I'm the sort of person where I ruminate on things for 3 hours afterwards and then suddenly have 20 questions.
There's a few of the researchers who are looking at like maybe creating games. So that might be something that later on they might want to contact you about.
Fascinating.
Could I ask a couple of things, Katie, before you disappear?
Definitely.
The first, I was thinking, because we've probably got a group of people here who quite enjoy horror, I think, particularly like horror films and things like that. And you were saying that the more senior people in the fire service get sort of used to dealing with trauma. Do you think the same applies to like watching a lot of horror films? You just get used to, you get used to it?
Yeah, so that I love that question too, Aggie. And the answer is, again, I don't have a clear response. So just drawing like similarities to that. One of the things that we always try and do with virtual reality experiments is control for sort of novelty effects of VR. So if you're someone who uses virtual reality a lot, do you have like a diminished response to stuff that's presented in it? And we find no evidence of that. at all, or we haven't found evidence of that so far. So it could be that you have kind of diminished responses, or it might be that actually the responses are just as salient and just as strong as they were from day one. And again, I think there's quite limited research on that at the moment. I mean, there's some work on desensitization, but it's really messy. There's quite mixed findings on that as well. So
yeah. Well, one other thing, I was really interested, you know, because you were looking at, like, you know, you said people tend to sweat, or they, you know, their heart rate changes. I know this sounds really funny, because I suppose we're going to be trying to generate those feelings in people, which it could be morally questionable anyway. But could you reverse engineer the effect and like make people have a quick heart rate and they're more likely to feel scared? Is that a thing?
That's really interesting question. So it's almost like biofeedback.
Yeah, so like if you got someone to run really quick, are they more likely to have the same sensation of fear than if they were sat down?
So there are some really interesting theories in social psychology, actually. I can send you a paper on this, where,
Awesome.
and you know, I don't know to the extent to which these experiments replicate, but these are fascinating. So you can get people to ascribe changes in their physiology to something that's immediate to them. So someone's heart rate could suddenly increase for a totally different reason, but they might ascribe it to the fact that, I don't know, they're on their first date at the cinema. So they just ascribe it to the fact that they fancy the person they're with, or something like that. So I think you probably could reverse engineer it to a degree. So as long as you make as long as you draw their attention to what you want them to attribute the increased heart rate to, I think that could actually work. Based on some existing research in social psychology. But again, more than happy to share some really interesting papers looking at that.
Wow, so that's awesome. Thank you. So yeah, maybe everyone wants to think about doing their projects on treadmills or something.
That would be fascinating. Yeah, and maybe you should collect the data. That would be cool.
Awesome. Oh, well, thank you so much for your time, your wonderful lecture. And if you're happy to share your details, Katie, that would be awesome in the chat, so that
definitely,
you know, they might be able to get in touch with you later on. But thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.